When the discussion turns to the bloodiest battles of World War II, the popular names that come up are often the Battle of Kursk or the Battle of Stalingrad. These were monumental confrontations, spreading across vast expanses and lasting for months. However, if we narrow the definition of battle to mean a single, uninterrupted moment of conflict in a relatively small battlefield, then the battle for the Seelow Heights, part of the Soviet final offensive into Berlin in April 1945, stands as a stark and bloody contender. Hello, dear audience, and here is Harold's channel. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel to receive our latest stories. Chapter 1. Prelude to Battle. The wind carried the scent of earth and gunpowder, mingling with the faint aroma of spring blossoms. The dawn light was breaking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the Soviet encampment. Captain Alexei Ivanov stood at the edge of the encampment, his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Seelow Heights. The formidable ridge loomed ahead, a reminder of the deadly task that lay before them. Alexei was a seasoned veteran, having fought from the gates of Moscow to the blood-soaked ruins of Stalingrad. His face, weathered and lined, bore the marks of years of war. His blue eyes, once bright with youthful zeal, now held a somber intensity. He had seen too much, lost too many comrades, and yet here he stood, ready to lead his men into battle once more. The camp was a hive of activity. Soldiers moved with purpose, checking their weapons, adjusting their uniforms, and exchanging hushed words of encouragement. The atmosphere was thick with a mix of anticipation and dread. Alexei could sense the fear among his men, but he also felt their resolve. They knew what was at stake. Berlin was within their grasp, and with it, the end of the war. As he walked through the camp, Alexei paused to speak with his platoon leaders. Each man bore the same weary expression, the same determined glint in their eyes. Lieutenant Sergei Petrov, a young officer fresh from the academy, saluted smartly. "Captain Ivanov, all preparations are complete. The men are ready." Alexei nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Sergei's shoulder. "Good work, Lieutenant. Keep the men focused. This will be the hardest fight we've faced yet." Sergei's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and determination. "Yes, sir, we won't let you down." Moving on, Alexei approached a group of soldiers gathered around a small fire. They were sharing a final meal, their faces etched with anxiety. Private Mikhail Sokolov, a burly man with a booming laugh that had often lifted the spirits of his comrades, looked up as Alexei approached. "Captain, join us. We were just reminiscing about home," Mikhail said, offering Alexei a piece of dark bread. Alexei accepted the bread with a nod, sitting down beside the fire. "Home," he repeated, the word heavy with longing. "What do you miss most, Mikhail?" Mikhail's eyes softened as he thought of his family. "My wife's cooking and my daughter's laughter. It's been so long since I heard it." The men around the fire nodded in agreement, each lost in their own memories of home. Alexei chewed the bread slowly, the taste bland but comforting in its familiarity. "We fight for them," he said quietly, "for all we've left behind, and for a future where they can live without fear." The soldiers murmured their agreement, the fire crackling as if in response. Alexei rose, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders. "Get some rest, men. Tomorrow will be a long day." As he made his way back to his tent, Alexei's thoughts turned to the coming battle. The Soviet High Command had outlined an ambitious plan. The 8th Guards Army, 3rd Shock Army, 5th Shock Army, and 47th Army were to break through the German defenses at Seelow Heights in a single day. It was a daunting task, one that would require every ounce of strength and courage they possessed. Marshal Zhukov, the commander of the 1st Byelorussian Front, had placed great faith in the plan. But Alexei harbored doubts. He had seen the terrain from reconnaissance photos, and he knew the Germans were entrenched in strong positions. The heights were a natural fortress, and the Germans would defend it with everything they had. As he reached his tent, Alexei saw Major General Ivan Konev, his superior and a man he deeply respected, approaching. Konev was a grizzled veteran, his face marked by the scars of countless battles. He greeted Alexei with a firm handshake. "Captain Ivanov, how are your men holding up?" Konev asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "They're ready, sir," Alexei replied. "Nervous but ready." Konev nodded, his gaze shifting to the distant ridge. "We've got a tough fight ahead, but we faced worse, haven't we?" Alexei managed a grim smile. "Yes, sir, we have." Konev clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Captain. We'll need you sharp tomorrow." As the night deepened, Alexei lay on his cot, staring at the canvas roof of his tent. His mind wandered to the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, and the family waiting for him back home. He thought of his wife Natalia and their young son Dmitri. It had been years since he had held them, years since he had heard their voices. Closing his eyes, Alexei whispered a silent prayer, for strength, for courage, and for the hope that this battle would bring them one step closer to peace. The roar of artillery in the distance was a constant reminder of the fight that awaited them. But for now, in the quiet moments before dawn, he allowed himself to dream of a world beyond the war. As sleep finally claimed him, Alexei knew that when the sun rose, they would march into the crucible of Seelow Heights. They would face the bloodiest battle yet, and many would not return. But they would fight with everything they had, for their comrades, for their families, and for the future of a world free from tyranny. Chapter 2. The Calm. The night before the offensive was a mosaic of nervous preparations and reflective pauses. Captain Alexei Ivanov found himself walking among the tents, where the subdued sounds of soldiers preparing for battle filled the air. There was an unspoken understanding that the following day could be their last. He could see the resolve mixed with apprehension in every face he passed. The camp was illuminated by the glow of lanterns, casting long shadows on the ground. As Alexei made his way through the camp, he overheard snippets of conversation, men discussing their loved ones, sharing pictures, and trading promises of what they'd do once the war was over. Nearby, a group of young soldiers gathered around an older sergeant who was regaling them with tales from earlier battles. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Petrovich, had a knack for storytelling, and his tales, though filled with horror, also carried a strange comfort. His words reminded them that many had faced such fears before and had lived to tell the tale. "Listen up, boys," Petrovich said, his voice raspy but clear. "I was at the siege of Leningrad, surrounded, starving, but we held on. We held on because we knew the entire country was counting on us. Tomorrow it'll be the same. They'll count on us again." The young soldiers listened, rapt, as the sergeant painted a picture of relentless endurance and eventual triumph. Alexei paused to listen too, knowing the value of such stories on the eve of battle. They were not just reminiscences. They were fuel for the soul, kindling for the spirit that would lead these men into the fire of combat. Alexei moved on, heading toward the command tent. Inside, maps were spread out over a large table, lit by several overhead lamps. Officers of various ranks clustered around, their faces tense as they discussed the final details of the assault. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of strong coffee. Major General Ivan Konev was there, pointing at the map, highlighting the key positions along Seelow Heights. "The initial bombardment will soften them up, but it's the infantry who'll have the tough job. We need to penetrate their lines here, here, and here," he said, his finger jabbing at the map decisively. Alexei joined the group, his gaze fixed on the map. The points Konev had indicated were heavily fortified German positions. Taking them would not be easy. "Have the recon units reported back yet?" Alexei asked, looking towards a junior officer who was coordinating battlefield intelligence. "Yes, Captain," the officer replied. "The latest aerial photos confirm heavy German fortifications. They've also laid extensive minefields here," he added, pointing to a sector just below the ridge. The room fell silent for a moment as the gravity of their task settled in. Then Konev looked up, his eyes meeting those of his officers. "We have faced worse," he repeated, his voice firm. Remember, we are not only fighting for land, but for the very freedom of our people. We push through no matter what." As the meeting dispersed, Alexei felt a mix of dread and determination. He knew what awaited his men on those heights. The pre-dawn hours offered him a moment of solitude, and he used it to visit the artillery units. The gunners were busy preparing their howitzers, loading shells, and calibrating their aim. The night was punctuated by the occasional testing of guns, the booming sound echoing ominously. He approached one of the artillery commanders, Major Sorokin, who was overseeing the loading of a particularly large howitzer. "Major, make sure every shell counts," Alexei said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sorokin nodded, his face grim but resolute. "We'll give them hell, Captain," he promised. Returning to his tent, Alexei tried to catch some rest. Yet sleep eluded him as his mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming battle. He pulled out a small, worn photograph of his family from his jacket pocket. Tracing their faces with his finger, he whispered a vow to return to them. The camp slowly quieted down as the soldiers tried to snatch a few hours of sleep amidst their anxiety. The silence of the night was a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon follow. Alexei too lay down, closing his eyes and listening to the rhythm of his own breathing, trying to find a moment of peace before the storm. As the first light of dawn tinged the sky with gray, the entire camp began to stir. Orders were given, and soldiers lined up, ready for the signal to advance. The air was crisp, and a light fog hung over the ground. In these quiet, suspended moments before battle, every man was alone with his thoughts, his fears, and his hopes. For Captain Alexei Ivanov and his men, the day that lay ahead would be the culmination of years of blood, sweat, and tears. The fight for Seelow Heights was about to begin, and with it, the final push towards Berlin. Chapter 3. The Assault Begins. As the first light of dawn seeped over the horizon, a tense silence hung over the Soviet encampment. It was abruptly shattered by the deafening roar of artillery. The ground shook violently underfoot as shells began their deadly arc toward the German defenses on Seelow Heights. The sky was streaked with the fiery trails of the bombardment, announcing the commencement of the offensive. Captain Alexei Ivanov stood among his men, watching the initial barrage with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very air. Beside him, the young Lieutenant Sergei Petrov looked on, his face pale, but set in a determined expression. "It's starting," he shouted over the din, his voice barely audible. Alexei nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant heights. The plan was ambitious, a relentless artillery barrage followed by a swift infantry advance. The bombardment was meant to devastate the German fortifications, but Alexei knew the reality of war often differed from the plans made on maps. As the barrage neared its end, the order came. "Forward," Alexei bellowed, drawing his pistol and leading his men out of the trenches. The ground ahead was pockmarked and uneven, the air thick with smoke and the stench of explosives. The men moved quickly, their boots sinking into the soft earth, each soldier carrying the weight of both their gear and their fears. The infantry's advance was met with fierce resistance. Despite the heavy shelling, the German defenses were far from broken. Machine gun fire raked the advancing Soviets from well-concealed bunkers, and the air was soon filled with the cries of the wounded. "Keep moving," Alexei urged his men, pushing forward through the chaos. He ducked as a shell exploded nearby, sending a shower of dirt and debris into the air. The battle had turned into a hellish landscape of noise, mud, and blood. Lieutenant Petrov and his squad were to Alexei's right, making their way towards a particularly strong German position. Alexei watched as Petrov led his men with courage, moving from cover to cover, returning fire whenever they could. Suddenly, a burst of enemy fire caught the squad off guard, and Petrov fell, wounded. Two of his men dragged him back to relative safety, his face contorted in pain but alive. Alexei couldn't pause. The momentum of the attack had to be maintained. He signaled to another officer, Captain Mironov, to take over Petrov's squad and keep pushing forward. Alexei himself joined the front line, firing his pistol at the shadowy figures in the German trenches. The battle raged without respite. By midday, the initial momentum seemed to stall as the Soviets encountered deeper layers of German defenses. Major General Konev arrived at the front line, assessing the situation with a critical eye. "We need to break through today," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of urgency. Konev ordered more troops forward and called for additional artillery support. The skies roared again as fresh barrages sought to soften the stubborn German resistance. Alexei found himself leading a charge to capture a key trench system. With a fierce cry, he and his men threw themselves against the enemy line, grenades and gunfire clearing their path. The trench warfare was brutal and intimate. Soviet and German soldiers fought desperately, the struggle reduced to the most primal forms of combat. Alexei, leading from the front, felt the surge of adrenaline overpowering the fatigue that gnawed at his limbs. Every captured trench felt like a significant victory, but each was bought at a high cost. By late afternoon, as the sun began its descent, a brief lull allowed Alexei and his men a moment to regroup. They were deep within the German lines now, the Seelow Heights looming ominously ahead, still not fully secured. The cost of the day's fighting was evident in the faces of his men, exhausted, grim, but undeterred. "We hold this line," Alexei commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting. "Reinforcements are coming, and we push again at dawn." As night fell, the battlefield was a grim tableau of destruction and human suffering. Alexei sat with his back against a captured bunker, looking out over the scarred landscape. They had made significant progress, but the battle for Seelow Heights was far from over. Tomorrow, they would face the enemy again, pushing for every inch of ground until victory was theirs, or until they could fight no more. The thought of his family flickered across his mind, a brief respite from the carnage. For them, he would endure. For them and for a world at peace, he would fight until the end. Chapter 4. Blood and Soil. The second day of the assault on Seelow Heights dawned with a heavy fog that cloaked the battlefield in a deceptive calm. The night had been intermittently pierced by the sounds of sporadic gunfire and the distant groans of the wounded, underscoring the savage intimacy of the night's skirmishes. As the fog began to lift, the grim reality set in. Bodies of soldiers from both sides lay strewn across the muddy terrain, a stark testament to the previous day's ferocity. Captain Alexei Ivanov rose from his makeshift cover at the first light, his uniform stained with mud and blood, his face gaunt with fatigue but resolute. His sleep had been brief and restless, haunted by the cries of the fallen. Around him, his men prepared for another day of combat, their faces set with grim determination. They cleaned their rifles, checked their ammunition, and tended to their minor wounds in silence, each man trapped in his own thoughts, perhaps pondering if today would be his last. The morning brief was terse. Major General Konev outlined the day's objectives with a clear urgency in his voice. Despite the significant gains from the previous day, German resistance remained fierce and well-organized. The strategic importance of Seelow Heights meant that the Germans would fight tooth and nail to hold it. The key to breaking their lines would be a coordinated push combining infantry assaults with heavy artillery and tank support. "Today, we break their spirit," Konev asserted, looking over the map with his field commanders. "We coordinate with the 5th Shock Army on our left flank and tighten the noose. Artillery will soften their strongest points at 0800 hours. Tanks move in at 0815. Infantry follows to secure the positions. No retreat, no surrender." As the artillery began their bombardment, Alexei gathered his company. "Listen up," he shouted, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Today we push forward with everything we have. Keep close, cover each other, and stay alert. We are the tip of the spear. The motherland counts on us." The ground trembled under the relentless artillery fire, a precursor to their advance. When the order came, Alexei led his men over the top, moving quickly through the churned earth towards the German lines. The air was thick with the smell of explosives and death, the sounds of battle a constant cacophony that drowned out all else. The advance was brutal. German machine gun nests carved deadly swaths through the advancing Soviets, forcing them to dive for cover in the shell craters that pockmarked the landscape. Alexei, moving from soldier to soldier, offered quick words of encouragement and tactical advice, his presence a steadying force amid the chaos. Midway through their advance, a sudden explosion to Alexei's left signaled the arrival of the tanks, their large forms looming through the smoke like beasts of war. Cheers rose from the Soviet lines at the sight of their armored support, boosting their morale. The tanks' heavy guns boomed, targeting German strongpoints, their shells creating breaches in the enemy defenses that Alexei's men quickly exploited. The fighting grew close and personal as they neared the main German trench line. Alexei and his men engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat, using rifles, grenades, and even their fists. Every step forward was contested with desperate intensity by the German defenders. By late afternoon, they had secured a significant portion of the German trenches, capturing several prisoners and valuable intelligence about the enemy's remaining fortifications. Exhausted but exhilarated, Alexei leaned against a captured bunker, wiping the sweat and grime from his face as he surveyed the area. "Sir, we've taken their communications post," reported a young sergeant, out of breath, but eyes alight with the thrill of victory. "Good," Alexei replied, his mind already turning to the next phase. "Gather any documents, maps, anything that might tell us what they're planning. We need every advantage." As his men set about securing their new positions and tending to the wounded, Alexei took a moment to rest. The battle was far from over, and the road to Berlin remained bloodied and uncertain. But today, they had made critical progress, and each victory brought them closer to ending the war. Looking out over the battlefield, Alexei felt a heavy sorrow for the lost lives, but held on to a fierce hope. They were fighting not just for territory, but for a future of peace. For now, that hope would have to sustain them through the battles yet to come. Chapter 5. Stalemate and Slaughter. By the third day, the battle for Seelow Heights had become a grim war of attrition. The initial Soviet surge had pushed the German defenders back significantly, but at a terrible cost. The landscape was scarred with the detritus of war: destroyed tanks, blasted trees, and the ever-increasing toll of human casualties. The morning broke with a relentless drizzle that turned the battlefield into a slippery morass, complicating movement and sinking the spirits of the men even further. Captain Alexei Ivanov started the day with a walk through the trenches, inspecting his men's positions and offering words of encouragement. The morale was low. Fatigue and the loss of comrades weighed heavily on everyone. The faces of his soldiers were etched with exhaustion, their eyes hollow from witnessing too much death. Major General Konev convened a meeting early in the morning with his commanders, including Alexei. The map of the battlefield was spread out on a makeshift table, dotted with markers indicating their progress and the stiff pockets of resistance that remained. "The Germans are reinforcing their positions overnight," Konev noted, his finger tracing the lines where the enemy had strengthened their defenses. "They're dug in deep and they're desperate, but so are we. We cannot afford a prolonged battle here. We must break through today." The plan was to concentrate their remaining artillery on the most fortified German positions, followed by an assault by the infantry, supported by tank brigades. Alexei was tasked with leading one of the key thrusts. The weight of the responsibility felt heavy on his shoulders, but he was determined not to let his men see his concern. As the artillery began their thunderous barrage, Alexei assembled his troops. "This is the push that will see us through," he shouted over the roar of the guns. "Keep your heads down and follow me." The ground shook with each explosion, a harsh reminder of the power of the Soviet artillery. But when Alexei's battalion surged forward, they met a wall of fire. The Germans had anticipated their tactics and were waiting. Machine guns chattered mercilessly, pinning them down. The advance stalled under the withering fire, and Alexei's men were forced to seek cover in the craters that pitted the battlefield. From his position, Alexei could see that other units were also struggling to make headway. The tanks that were supposed to support them were delayed, stuck in the mud, or knocked out by anti-tank fire. The coordination that was crucial to the day's plan was falling apart. Alexei crawled to where a group of his men were hunkered down, sharing their scant cover. "We can't wait for the tanks," he yelled, making a quick decision. "We'll use grenades to clear the pillboxes. On my signal, we move fast and hard. Stay close." What followed was a desperate, bloody crawl through the mud, from one cover to the next, slowly inching closer to the German lines. Every meter gained was paid for in blood. Alexei led from the front, lobbing grenades ahead of their path, clearing the way for his men to advance. By late afternoon, they reached the first German pillbox. A brutal, close-quarters fight ensued. Alexei and his men used everything at their disposal, rifles, knives, even bare hands, to overcome the defenders. The combat was ferocious and personal, with neither side giving quarter. When the pillbox was finally secured, Alexei looked around at the few men who had made it with him. They were battered and muddy, their faces grim with the intensity of the fight. But there was also a glint of triumph in their eyes. They had achieved their objective against daunting odds. The day ended with the Soviets holding a tenuous grip on the new positions. They had advanced, but the cost was visible in the exhausted, bloodied faces of the men and the rows of bodies that lay behind them. That night, Alexei sat with his commanders, their faces lit by the flickering light of a lantern. They reviewed the day's gains, but the conversation was subdued. The victory was too costly, the progress too slow. As he prepared for another night in the trenches, Alexei thought of his family and the men he had lost. He knew the battle was not over, and the next day would bring more fighting. But now there was a glimmer of hope. Each step forward was a step closer to ending the war. With that thought, he settled into his makeshift bed, the sounds of distant artillery lulling him into a restless sleep, ready to fight another day. Chapter 6. Breakthrough. The morning of the fourth day at Seelow Heights greeted Captain Alexei Ivanov with a rare sight: a clear sky. The sun's rays pierced through the lingering smoke of the battlefield, casting long shadows and illuminating the stark devastation. The ground was littered with debris from the previous day's assaults, twisted metal, shattered weaponry, and the unclaimed dead. Yet, amidst this desolation, there was a palpable sense of urgency and a flicker of hope among Alexei's men. Today could be the day of the breakthrough. Major General Konev convened his commanders at dawn, the map table now marked heavily with the positions taken and those still contested. "We have pushed them hard, and they are weakening, but we have not yet broken them," he began, his voice steady despite the fatigue evident on his weathered face. "Today we concentrate all efforts on breaking through their final lines. We expect heavy resistance, but we have fresh reserves coming in. We will use this to our advantage." Alexei was tasked with leading the main thrust directly at the heart of the remaining German defenses. His company would be reinforced by a platoon of fresh troops, giving them the numbers and the morale boost needed for such a critical assault. Before moving out, Alexei addressed his assembled men. Standing atop a damaged tank, he looked over the faces of his soldiers, their features hardened by days of relentless fighting. "Comrades, the enemy is nearly spent," he declared, projecting confidence. "Today we finish what we started. For your brothers, for your families, for the motherland, let us end this battle as victors." Cheers rose from the men, their spirits lifted by Alexei's words. They formed up, advancing in tight formations as they moved toward the designated breach point. The artillery had already begun softening the target area, their booms a constant backdrop to the infantry's determined march. As they approached the German lines, the air was filled with the familiar deadly chorus of gunfire and explosions. Alexei led from the front, his rifle in hand, moving swiftly and with purpose. They reached the first German trench, encountering fierce resistance. The combat was brutal and direct, with both sides exchanging grenades and gunfire at close range. Through sheer force of will and superior numbers, Alexei's men managed to overpower the defenders, securing the trench and capturing several prisoners. Without pausing, they pressed on, exploiting the confusion and disorder among the German ranks. The sound of tank engines announced the arrival of the armored support that had been delayed the previous day. Tanks rolled forward, their guns blasting holes in the remaining German fortifications. The synergy of infantry and armor was effective, and slowly but surely, the Soviet forces began to dominate the battlefield. By midday, the signs of a German collapse were becoming evident. Messages intercepted from German commanders spoke of low ammunition and high casualties. Alexei pushed his men harder, sensing victory was within reach. In the early afternoon, they reached a key juncture point which controlled access to the main road leading to Berlin. Capturing it was crucial, and it was here that the Germans made their last stand. The battle raged for hours, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Alexei, amidst the chaos, remained a focal point for his men, directing their efforts and providing strategic leadership under fire. As the sun began to set, the German resistance finally broke. The junction was secured, and the road to Berlin lay open. The men were exhausted, many slumping to the ground where they stood, overcome with relief and fatigue. Alexei, though weary, felt a surge of pride as he walked among his troops, clapping them on the back and congratulating them on their courage and perseverance. That night, as they consolidated their position, Alexei met with Major General Konev, who had come forward to the newly captured lines. "Well done, Captain Ivanov," Konev said, his face grim, but his eyes alight with the victory. "Today, you and your men have paved the way to Berlin. We owe you much." Alexei felt a deep satisfaction, not for the praise, but for the knowledge that the end of the war was now truly in sight. Yet, as he looked around at his tired and dirty men, he knew the cost had been high. Many faces he remembered were absent, lives given for the yards gained. As they prepared for the final push to Berlin, Alexei took a moment to reflect on the battle's toll. He thought of the families who would not welcome home their sons, brothers, and fathers. It was for them he fought now, to ensure their losses were not in vain. Tomorrow they would move again, but tonight they rested, their hearts heavy with the cost of war, but hopeful for peace. Chapter 7. Reflections in the Rubble. The day after the breakthrough at Seelow Heights was markedly different. The relentless clamor of battle had receded, replaced by a tense quiet that blanketed the battlefield. The Soviet forces, now firmly in control of the strategic high ground, took the opportunity to regroup and reorganize. Captain Alexei Ivanov, his uniform still caked with the grime of combat, walked among his men, offering words of encouragement and overseeing the establishment of defensive positions. The road to Berlin was open, but they all knew the fight was far from over. As the sun rose, casting long shadows over the scarred landscape, Alexei found himself looking out towards Berlin, the city's outline just visible in the distance. Major General Konev joined him, his presence a steady reassurance amidst the uncertainty. "Today we breathe, Alexei," Konev said, his voice low. "Tomorrow we march into the heart of the beast." Alexei nodded, his mind weary but focused. "The men need this day, to remember why we're here and to prepare for what's next." Konev clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie and respect. "They have a good leader to guide them. Make sure you also take a moment for yourself, Captain. You've earned it." Leaving Konev to coordinate with the other units, Alexei made his way to a makeshift aid station where the medics were busy attending to the wounded. The sight of the injured, some gravely, was a stark reminder of the cost of their success. He spent time with each soldier, listening to their stories, sharing their pain, and offering assurances that their sacrifices were not in vain. Later, Alexei joined a group of soldiers who had gathered around a small fire, sharing scarce rations and stories from the front lines. The camaraderie among the men was palpable, born of shared hardship and the bond of survival. As they talked, the conversation turned to the fallen comrades, each name evoking a story, a laugh, a tear. Private Mikhail Sokolov, the burly soldier with a booming laugh, raised his tin cup. "To those who aren't with us," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "may their memory drive us forward." "To victory," another soldier added, his voice a mix of resolve and sorrow. Alexei joined in the toast, feeling the weight of each name in his heart. He thought of the families waiting at home, of his own wife and son, and of the peace he hoped they were fighting for. That night, as Alexei lay in his temporary quarters, the quiet gave way to reflection. The rubble of Seelow Heights, both literal and metaphorical, was behind them, but the challenges ahead loomed large. Berlin was not just a city, it was a symbol, a fortress at the heart of the Nazi regime. The battle for Berlin would be unlike any they had faced before. As he drifted into a fitful sleep, Alexei dreamt of the days after the war. He saw himself returning home, walking through his village, embracing his family. The dream was vivid, filled with colors and sounds he hadn't experienced in years. It was a brief escape from the reality of war, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The next morning, the Soviet forces began their advance towards Berlin. The air was charged with a mix of apprehension and determination. Alexei led his men with a renewed sense of purpose, each step taking them closer to the end of the war. As they marched, the ruins of the cities and towns they passed spoke silently of the war's toll. Alexei kept his focus forward, driven by the dream of peace and the memory of those who had fallen. The final battle was ahead, and he was ready to lead his men into history, into the heart of darkness, to emerge into the light of a new dawn. Chapter 8. Toward the Reichstag. The march towards Berlin was marked by a strange juxtaposition of calm and chaos. As the Soviet forces moved deeper into German territory, signs of disarray among the German troops became more evident. Deserted posts, abandoned equipment, and a sense of hurried retreat pervaded the landscape. Yet the closer they came to Berlin, the more intense the resistance became. Pockets of German soldiers, many young and some clearly old men from the Volkssturm, the German national militia, fought with desperate ferocity, defending every block, every street with everything they had left. Captain Alexei Ivanov's battalion was at the forefront of the push towards the city center. The battle-hardened soldiers, now veterans of numerous engagements, advanced with a grim determination. The scars of war were etched deep into their faces, and their eyes spoke volumes of the horrors they had witnessed. Yet there was also a palpable sense of urgency among them, a collective drive to end the war as swiftly as possible. As they approached the outskirts of Berlin, the landscape transformed. Buildings became more dense, the streets narrower, and the warfare more complex. Urban combat was a different beast, one that required careful, methodical progress and constant vigilance against sniper fire and ambushes. Alexei led his men through the shattered suburbs, navigating through rubble and ruins. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of explosives. Every corner could hide an enemy, every window could mask a sniper's nest. The constant tension was exhausting, mentally and physically, but Alexei kept his focus sharp, knowing that any lapse could cost lives. One afternoon, as they cleared a particularly stubborn pocket of resistance in a small residential area, Alexei received new orders from Major General Konev. His battalion was to advance on and secure a strategic government building located a few kilometers from the Reichstag. The building was heavily fortified and held by elite SS troops, determined to fight to the last man. Gathering his officers, Alexei outlined the plan. "We'll approach from two sides. Teams Alpha and Bravo will flank the building, while Charlie provides covering fire. We need to be quick, precise, and ruthless. Remember, the enemy is cornered, and they will be dangerous." The operation commenced at dusk, under the cover of fading light. The soldiers moved stealthily, using the debris and bombed-out cars for cover. As they neared the target, gunfire erupted, a loud, chaotic symphony that shattered the eerie silence of the evening. The battle for the building was fierce and prolonged. The SS troops were well-trained and well-armed, but the Soviet soldiers, led by Alexei, were relentless. Room by room, floor by floor, they cleared the building. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand, as both sides knew the strategic importance of the position. It took hours, but as midnight approached, Alexei's battalion finally secured the building. They were exhausted, many wounded, but victorious. As they set up defensive positions, Alexei took a moment to look towards the Reichstag, visible now in the distance, its silhouette looming against the night sky. The final assault on the Reichstag would be a symbol of victory, but Alexei knew that the true battle was for peace, not just for conquest. As he watched his men fortify their new position, he felt a deep, solemn pride in their resilience and bravery. The next days were a blur of fighting, advancing, and securing positions. When the order finally came to advance on the Reichstag, Alexei was ready. His men, though tired to the bone, were driven by the knowledge that each step was a step closer to the end of the war. As they moved out, Alexei thought of his family, of the peaceful days to come, and of the men who had fallen so that others might live in peace. With every step, every battle, he carried these thoughts with him, a silent prayer that this final push would indeed bring an end to the long years of suffering. The march to the Reichstag was not just a military operation, it was a march towards a new beginning, towards a future that Alexei hoped would be free from the shadow of war. Chapter 9. Victory at a Price. The assault on the Reichstag was a microcosm of the war itself, fierce, chaotic, and laden with a heavy toll. The iconic building stood as the last bastion of Nazi resistance, a symbol of the regime that Captain Alexei Ivanov and his men had fought so tirelessly to overcome. As they approached, the building was already heavily damaged, its facade pockmarked by shells, and its once grand structure surrounded by the rubble of a city that had seen too much war. The fighting was intense. German defenders, a mix of hardened SS troops and young boys too inexperienced for the ferocity they faced, held on with a desperation born of knowing they had nowhere else to retreat. The Soviets, for their part, pushed forward with a grim resolve, fueled by years of suffering and loss, and a deep desire to end the war. Alexei led his battalion with a calm ferocity, moving through the shattered streets and debris with tactical precision. Each step forward was contested with bullets and blood. As they made their way through the building, room by room, floor by floor, the air was thick with smoke and the deafening sounds of gunfire and grenades. When they finally captured the Reichstag, planting the Soviet flag atop its ruins, it was a moment of profound triumph, mixed with exhaustion. Alexei stood before the battered building, watching as the flag fluttered in the breeze, a poignant symbol of victory and sacrifice. His heart was heavy with the cost of this war, the faces of fallen friends haunting his thoughts. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Berlin surrendered, and the war in Europe drew to its official close. The city was a vast landscape of ruin, but amidst the destruction, there was a burgeoning sense of hope. People emerged from hiding, weary and wary, but alive. Alexei and his men were hailed as heroes, but the celebration felt hollow to those who understood the true cost of their victory. As the battalion prepared to return home, Alexei found himself grappling with mixed emotions: relief at the war's end, sorrow for the immense loss of life, and uncertainty about the future. The journey back to the Soviet Union was long and gave him time to reflect on the years of conflict, the personal losses, and the scars that would not easily heal. Arriving home was bittersweet. Alexei was reunited with his wife, Natalia, and his son, Dmitry, who had grown so much in his absence. The reunion was filled with tears and laughter, relief and joy, but also a deep-seated pain that could not be easily expressed. The village had changed, marked by the war, just as he was. Neighbors greeted him, their faces lined with the stories of their own hardships. In the weeks that followed, Alexei struggled to adjust to peacetime. The sounds of war still echoed in his mind, and the tranquility of his village sometimes felt unsettlingly quiet. He took to walking the fields in the early morning, trying to reconcile the soldier he had become with the man he needed to be for his family. One day, while walking, he met an old comrade, Mikhail Sokolov, who had also returned home. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes and fears, reflecting on the war and what it had meant. It was in these conversations that Alexei found some solace, a shared understanding that helped bridge the gap between his past and his present. Years later, Alexei became a modest voice for veterans, sharing his story not for glory, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He spoke of the importance of peace, the value of understanding, and the need to remember the past, not to glorify war, but to prevent its horrors from being repeated. As an old man, Alexei often sat by the fire with his grandchildren, telling them stories of bravery and sacrifice, but always emphasizing the cost of war and the priceless value of peace. His legacy was not just that of a soldier who had fought in one of history's bloodiest conflicts, but as a man who had come home and dedicated himself to ensuring that such suffering would never be forgotten. In the twilight of his years, Alexei looked back not with pride at what he had conquered, but with gratitude for what he had helped to build. A world striving towards peace, ever mindful of the past, ever hopeful for the future. Years passed, and the world slowly reshaped itself in the aftermath of the war. Captain Alexei Ivanov, once a soldier at the forefront of some of the most brutal battles of the Eastern Front, had aged gracefully into an old man whose eyes still reflected the sharpness and the pain of his youth. His hair had turned silver, and his steps were slower, but his spirit remained undiminished. Alexei lived a quiet life in his small village, surrounded by the growing families of his children and grandchildren. Alexei had seen the world change in ways he could hardly have imagined as a young soldier. The Cold War had risen and fallen, new conflicts had sparked and sputtered, and through it all, he had maintained a steadfast belief in the importance of peace and reconciliation. His experiences during the war had taught him the deep cost of hatred and division, lessons he imparted to anyone who would listen. Each year, on the anniversary of the victory in Europe, Alexei would stand before a local monument, a simple statue erected in the village square to honor those who had fought and fallen. It was here that he shared stories not of victories or heroic charges, but of the moments of humanity that had shone through the darkest times. He spoke of the German soldier who had shared water with him during a ceasefire, of the letters from home that had kept his spirits alive, and of the dreams of peace that had sustained him through the battle. School children, their lives untouched by the horrors of war, would gather around Alexei, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe. He taught them the importance of remembering history, not just the dates and battles, but the stories of the people who lived through it, who shaped it with their actions and their choices. Alexei also became a small part of a larger movement, working with veterans groups to ensure that the welfare of those who had served was never forgotten. His modest home became a place of pilgrimage for younger veterans, who came to him for advice and left with stories that bridged generations. As Alexei grew older, he began to write his memoirs, a project he approached with a sense of duty rather than nostalgia. He wrote not for fame, but to leave a record of the truth as he had seen it, a counter to the glorification of war he so often saw in films and books. His writings were simple, honest, and poignant, reflecting his belief that peace was something to be actively nurtured, not passively hoped for. In his final years, Alexei's health began to wane, but his commitment to peace never faltered. He was awarded several honors, both from his home country and from abroad, accolades that he accepted with humility. He knew that his true legacy would not be the medals on his wall, but the peace he had fought for and the family who surrounded him. When Alexei passed away, his funeral was attended not just by his family and the villagers, but by people from many walks of life whose lives he had touched. His grandchildren spoke of him not just as a war hero, but as a hero of peace, a man who had returned from the war, determined to build a better world. Alexei Ivanov was laid to rest beneath a simple gravestone, under the shade of trees he had planted decades ago. Engraved upon the stone were his name, his ranks, and a short epitaph he had chosen himself. Here lies a soldier of the world who fought for peace. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below.